qualitative. Okay. We are on the record now, so I'll start again. I'm really pleased to welcome you for the launch of the Network for Practice and Process Management Studies growing on the African context. We are launching this network because our goal is to grow partnerships and collaborations between practice and process researchers in Africa and beyond. That's how the idea came about. And our goal for the network, can you go to the next slide, Natasha? The network is supported through the Warwick Stellenbosch University partnership, and one of our main goals for the network is to enable collaboration where researchers from Africa have access to a wealth of empirical data and access to the settings, to the local context. And often researchers in Warwick, they have new theoretical perspectives they could explore. So these are the founding principles of the collaboration and the kind of collaborative work that we are looking to foster. As part of the network, we have other goals that go beyond collaboration. We're interested in exploring management studies in Africa with practice-based sensitivity. So really exploring and understanding what management practices in Africa look like and what makes them distinct, and how we could theorize and understand our observations from African settings. So these are some of the main objectives behind the network. And we are convinced that there are elements of the African context that strengthen certain aspects of practice-based phenomena. So as part of the network, we'll be really focusing on phenomena, future-making practices and imaginaries, and really exploring these sensitivities, ritual-based practices. These are practices which we encounter in Africa and are somewhat documented in the literature, but not necessarily very well understood. We're also interested in spiritual practices, ritual practices, practices that go beyond rationality. So these are topics Jose and Andre will talk to you about it soon. So
thank you so much, Mira. And on point, just joining us now is Professor Sibu from Stellenbosch University. That was really the started off with this partnership. So we've also invited her to just share some remarks around the partnership between Warwick University and Stellenbosch. Welcome, Prof. Sibu. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, I managed to mute myself. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning or afternoon. I don't know where everybody is at the moment, but thank you so much for inviting me, and greetings to everybody. And thanks, Natasha, for giving me a chance to just make a few remarks. So I just want to check that you can hear me, Natasha, from your side.
Sorry. Yes.
Can you hear me, Natasha?
Yes.
You were also on mute. Okay, no, that's fine. So I just want to start off here. So just to, first of all, acknowledge everybody and welcome to the launching of the Network for Practice and Process Management Studies, which has a theme of drawing on an African empirical setting. So I really want to thank you for, your time, and also for the organizers for this session. So first of all, to, of course, acknowledge Warwick University Business School, and then Stellenbosch University Business School as well. And then, of course, I just want to also acknowledge Professor Anne Langley, who is also Emeritus Professor and Deputy Editor of the Academy of Management Journal. as well as Professor Daniel Branch, of course, the Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for Africa, University of Warwick. And I just want to thank him and, of course, the team as well that really helps us as a university to push our partnerships forward on the internationalization level. And, of course, Natasha, who's, been helping me to put a few remarks together as well. I think I should also acknowledge everyone else, the acting director of the business school, Professor Tassi, the staff, students, and esteemed guests and institutions that are present. So just in terms of setting the context, we know that the network, of course, has been set up to, promote the practice and process management studies that draw on the African empirical setting. This is a joint initiative, of course, between Warwick Business School and University of Stellenbosch Business School. And of course, the aim that has been given, and this I believe has been shared with you already, is to scope out current knowledge about African management practices and to develop relevant theoretical perspectives which would enable networking among scholars to carry out, of course, practice-based studies on the African continent, as well as strengthening capacity amongst the different researchers. And I think maybe what I need to just say is that so why is this important? So first of all, I think to just mention that Stellenbosch University, of course, we have a vision to be Africa's leading research-intensive university. And we want to be recognized, of course, for excellence in terms of the type of research we do and the types of innovations that we can come up with, and also the contribution that we can make to policy while we advance knowledge, of course, in service of society. And the part that is important to really emphasize is the area around service of society and what that means. So we are committed, of course, to the pursuit of knowledge, research, and innovation in service of society. And for us, we believe that to do this, we need to partner with various stakeholders, not just universities, but also the communities where we find ourselves in as universities, the industry partners, the businesses in that region. And then if we think about the South African context, if you ask me, so the biggest challenges we still have within our context are really around unemployment, poverty, inequality, and also the grand challenges really, which have been well articulated within the South African Decadal Plan, which was approved in 2022, and it runs up to 2032. And I think for the colleagues who are doing research in this area, it's important to know that when you think of these grand challenges, they're not just South African problems. They are Pan-African because they touch the rest of the continent. But even the global north, I mean, Europe and even the UK itself, when we talk about climate change and sustainability, that is the global issue, local issue, regional issue, then education, skills, and the future of work, health innovation, sustainability, energy, nutrition security, water security, and the high, of course, technology and industrialization, which is happening in some areas of the continent. And then, the ICTs and smart systems area, which we also need to focus on, considering the rapid increase in technology and the advances around, AI, artificial intelligence, and the skills that are needed for the future. So all of this become important. And the key is still around how does one take the local context into account? How does one put a perspective on the African context in terms of what we are doing? So this network will help us to reinforce collaborations between the two institutions. And we are really glad that, Warwick University has been very supportive in this area. This year and last year, I think we had some seed funding grants, for example, which we put aside, even though the money is not enough to cover every initiative, but at least to kickstart the conversations. And so I'm really glad that we're having this network conversation going on. And so on the South African side, I mentioned the Decadal Plan, which also lists those, global challenges, our grand challenges, which we have described. But with all of this, I mean, the reason is really trying to have an agenda that takes into account, how we measure impact in terms of our learning and teaching, the outcomes that are important in terms of setting an agenda, where the outcomes of the research that we do, the outcomes of the teaching and learning can benefit the communities, societies, and also the context where we find ourselves in. And then making sure that we strengthen, our partnerships, but also involving postgraduate students, master's students. I think the other area we're looking at is really trying to come up also with possible postdoctoral exchange programs, which I believe that we should still push that agenda. And really also for younger emerging scholars, having opportunities for our scholars also to spend time at different institutions, maybe at Stellenbosch, and those who may want also to spend time in the UK. So with all these, I think opportunities that are there, and opportunities that we're thinking about, and also this workshop and network that you have arranged, I'd like to encourage us as we speak to think really about, what are the critical challenges in our regions? How can we make sure we have these equitable partnerships? People would always talk about also the type of partnerships that you have. And in most cases, as universities, we have, I can tell you, like annually, we sign over 1,600 contracts, MOUs on the shelf, but not all of them are active. So I think to see this network being launched, to me, is actually very important. And so I want to again congratulate all of you and the organizers for organizing this. So Natasha, can I hand over? Thank you very much, and wishing you the best. But again, like I say, as we discuss whatever the outcomes, but let's also push an agenda to scale within the network, looking at mobility, which is important for me, academic exchange, but also, of course, some seed funding to help to kick off some of the projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Sibu. So I'll just hand over to Mira to introduce Prof. Dan.
I think you're muted, Mira.
Thank you, Natasha. I think from the side of Warwick, we'd like to welcome Professor Daniel Branch to say a few words about the partnership with Stellenbosch and the launch of the network.
Thank you, Mira. And it's always a delight seeing Sibu. So great to see you. And I'll repeat all the thanks to the organisers for the event. I'm here in my capacity, well, two capacities really. I'm the academic director for our doctoral college here at Warwick, but I'm also a deputy pro-vice chancellor for Africa, a role I'm very proud to share with Franklin Lisk in our politics department. Over the past 2 years, we've spent an awful lot of time with Stellenbosch developing a really strong and fruitful partnership. It's very easy, I think, to sit in meetings and talk about how things could be. It's always difficult to, I think the real challenge lies with academics and researchers taking things forward. So I'm absolutely delighted to see this initiative taking off. And all the credit for it goes to Natasha and Mira. There are many reasons, I think, why we're at Warwick. We're very proud of the relationship with Stellenbosch. One is just simply an opportunity to connect researchers and students here at Warwick with outstanding counterparts in South Africa. Another, though, I think, which deserves mention now, is Stellenbosch's really striking track record in supporting collaboration across Africa. This is something that's always impressed all of us involved in the partnership from the very, very beginning. And I hope very much this network becomes another example of those connections forged in Stellenbosch and in Warwick that will bring together researchers from across the African continent, as well as between our two institutions. I don't want to say too much, but I think it's important to stress that underpinning this partnership are a set of shared values between the two universities. Both, I think, is very obvious, place huge value on our internationalization efforts. These are fundamental to what we do on a day-to-day basis on our campuses. I think we both believe that the successful university in the 21st century is a global one. The very best research is often done collaboratively and internationally, but it's also the case that we know that African researchers, particularly outside of South Africa, are often excluded from that, from those networks as well. So the potential here, I think, to grow this network, to develop it, and to think carefully about its future, I think is really, really exciting. Engaging with researchers from across the globe, particularly in Africa, brings new perspectives, new insight, and new talent into research groups. So I'm very pleased to be here and wish the network all the best. I think it embodies the very best of what our two institutions are trying to do. So thank you very much.
So I think next person to say a few words is our co-host of the network, José Bento da Silva. Over to you, José.
Can people hear me? Because I don't know where the mic is.
The mic is there, yeah.
Oh, it's powerful now. So thank you for having me. I was invited to speak very briefly. I'm a bit scared because the previous people who spoke did put in academic stuff. But I was asked to briefly speak about rationality and how the African context could potentially help, which is something that I wouldn't know because I don't know the context that well, apart from having been born there. What I do is the context in Latin America where I work, and therefore I brought in a couple of thoughts, very brief ones, on how eventually we can learn from all those different contexts through the exploration of the limits of reason, as I agree with Mira. So very briefly, if I would summarize what has happened in our field and in other fields like sociology in the last 50 years, I would say, citing Roger Bastide, the French sociologist, that we have been pretty much interested in the awakened man and not in the sleeping man. I'm citing, hence using the word man and not human being. Things that we have forgotten, wrong, eventually alerted us to the same thing, which when he spoke about the over-socialized conception of man, we tend to think that only these things that are graspable, seen, can constitute the basis for knowledge about society. And when it comes to dreams, which is something that I've been particularly interested in after my study in the Latin American context, we forget that they usually interpenetrate myths, and well, myths are the basis for collective ideation, and I think everyone in the room knows where that leads then in terms of our sociology work and so on. This calls for going after things that are not easily graspable, that are not evident, that we think cannot constitute the basis for science or social science more broadly, are quite surprisingly or not new. You find them across the 20th century, not least in people like Durkheim, who made a point in speaking about the tensions between the ephemeral and the perennial. You would say that in social sciences, we are looking into what is the perennial, the stable, but we are not. We are in fact looking into what is ephemeral and speculative, which we think explains humans and the world only because we call it science. But in fact, what remains tends to be what we think is ephemeral. And that's, I think, the contradictions that could be interesting when we go into contexts that are not totally dominated by our worldview. So I think when we engage theoretically with different contexts, if I may speak bluntly, the temptation is not to colonize them again with the categories that in the West we should be getting rid of. Otherwise, we'll be building, citing Durkheim again, systems of forces without ideas, thinking that we are doing precisely the opposite. The tension here, I think that Durkheim called our attention upon quite brilliantly, is that social sciences advance slowly, but life cannot wait. And we have been forgetting those elements of life in social studies. And that's where I think issues around spirituality, religion, which is why I was asked to speak a bit, and magic more broadly can help. And that knowledge about those practices from other contexts can be particularly enlightening. Citing myself and Paolo Quattrone in a work that is forthcoming at some point, that's how I called it, because you know what this means. The true religion of contemporary times is reductionism, reducing everything to categories. Reductionism is the belief that everything that constitutes society, that constitutes reality, can be reduced to single, simple, and simplistic components. be this ourselves or a monetary value. We now tend to reduce everything to monetary measures, targets, and utility, forgetting that economics lost its grace when Adam Smith reduced the mystery of value to utility and then to market price. And here we stand, forgetting what led to this. And therefore, I think this kind of network with other institutions from other contexts can constitute the opportunity to revisit these things that we had in the West and lost, instead of trying to, again, speaking bluntly, trying to colonize other contexts with the categories that we now unfortunately realize are extremely limited and for sure are not working as they should. That's it. Hope it's what you expected. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jose. I think you uplifted the conversation to that intellectual rigor that we aim for. I will pass on to Natasha to tell you a little bit about the network as we see it, as it's expected to take place, and ways you could engage with it in the future.
Thanks so much, Mira. And yes, it's me standing between yourself and our brilliant keynote speaker. So just a few thoughts on my side. Mira and I started this conversation a little over a year ago in Cairo. I had absolutely no idea what was this woman talking about. What do you mean practice studies? Not knowing I was actually doing a form of process and practice research myself. So it was very enlightening to find this group. We have been journeying for a while, just trying to move my slide. So the network has been in progress since the beginning of the year. We officially kicked it off by hosting a workshop at the Africa Academy of Workshop in January 2024. That was hosted in Cape Town at our business school. And it's also lovely to see some of our colleagues and friends that shared on that day with us. Anna Marie is here, Catherine's here. So a number of our colleagues still journeying with us. So during that workshop, the one-day workshop at Durbanville Hills, we informally made a pact that we want to continue this conversation. We want to continue collaborating. And that's where we took it one step further to get some seed funding, just to officially get us going with a little bit of infrastructure and resources. And the seed fund between Stellenbosch University and Warwick was launched at the end of January. Behind the scenes, there's also other things that's been going on. Some of the participants or the group members have had workshops at the Academy as well. Mira and some of her colleagues launched a special issue in JME around practice studies, specifically focusing in higher education. We've applied for funding so that we can continue the development on this. And yeah, to just continue capacity building. So based on the strategic priorities and focus areas that Mira shared, this is just a little bit what it looks like in practice. So we have two PIs, for lack of a better word, holding the two institutions, but the network is beyond just the two institutions. It is about collaborating with our partners across Africa. So we have a number of participants and members of the team that are based in different schools and universities in Africa. The strategic priorities that Mira highlighted in the strategy has been unpacked in a structure, but in a nutshell, first of all, there is a link. We will share it in the chat. So if you want to become part of the conversation, if you just want to connect with us, there is a website that has been established, and we'll continue updating that. And thank you so much for Louise and the team on that side. Where we are at, we have identified, so in these all hands network or the practice areas, we've identified coordinators or people that will steer the work in understanding what we have available from a knowledge point of view. So I think Catherine is on the call with us. She works closely with Anne-Marie as well. They focus very specifically on strategy. We also have a team looking at innovation. Laurent and a few colleagues are looking at sustainability. We have an entrepreneurship stream at the moment, and at the moment I'm holding the organization and work practices. So that in a nutshell is what it looks like in practice. Our very first priority in our stream, in the organization stream, is we focused on organizational change as a process, because that's my field. We've started with a narrative review just to look at the lay of the land and see what do we know about that in an African context. So that will set the tone and set the research agenda for where we go. And then we will all, well, most of us connect again at the Warwick Summer School next year in July for the next, to kick off the next phase. Mira, over to you.
Just a few more words, right? The way the network is imagined, it will have these two sides. So on the one side, all hands workshops, which will be online, where we have conversations online on specific topics. And today we have Langley talking to us, and we'll be organizing 2 or 3 more workshops for the rest of the year. Then separately, we'll be putting together these working groups. At the moment, we're in the process of appointing leads for these working groups and setting up for them a way to review their assigned area of research, with a view towards coming back together after the Africa Academy of Management Conference in Morocco in January 2026. So we're really hoping you're all interested in taking part in the networks through the website, through our communication. Hopefully you'll be able to join the working group of your interest. And I think without further ado, I would like to hand over to Anne Langley, who's been modest about her knowledge of Africa, but she's here to talk to us based on her experience as supervisor, as a researcher, as editor. I think she can share a lot as to how studies from the African context can contribute to the discipline of management. Over to you, Anne.
Okay, thank you so much, Mira and Natasha, for inviting me to participate in this session. And hi also to several colleagues. I saw in Warwick, Jose, and others. So I have a presentation which I will try to share. I hope it's going to work. Just a minute. One moment. So does that work?
Yes, it's coming through.
All right. Okay, so as Mira indicated, I feel a little bit of an imposter in some ways because I have not personally done research in the African context, although I have had a doctoral student, Kafui Dansou, from Senegal, who did a practice-based study there on strategies practice in nonprofit organizations. And I will come back a little bit to her work and her thoughts about her work a little bit later. And I'm also an editor at Academy of management journal, and I've been very pleased to see that there have been submissions from based on African context, several of which I've been handling, and I'm hopeful that some of them will ultimately appear in the journal. So I think there's some dynamism around the topic of today's topic. So I'm just going to introduce a little bit the idea of process and practice studies. What are we talking about? And then I'm going to give some illustrations of work that's been published that is based on an African context, and look at some of the things we might learn from this and the kinds of learning that we could gain from this. So I hope that that is satisfactory for our purposes today. Whoops. Yes, so what do we mean by process and practice perspectives? So both of these perspectives focus very much on what people do. So they're about doing. They're not about static concepts. They're very much focused on the doing. So if we take a process perspective, process thinking implies considering phenomena in motion as unfolding over time, as becoming. So their approaches to understanding the world in terms of evolution over time, temporality, and flow. What then is practice studies, and how is this different? So practices can be defined as accepted ways of doing things. So that it's a kind of pattern of activity that that people engage in. Launch of a program is a kind of a practice. Giving a seminar is a practice. And practices are things that people do, but they embed knowledge. So we all know how to do a seminar, right? And our knowing of how to do a seminar is embedded in the doing of it. And so a practice-based perspective, I think, is particularly interesting when you're thinking about contextualized phenomena. So managing might involve a form of knowing that's different from elsewhere. And it's very difficult to access if you're not actually doing it, if you're somewhere else. So I think the practice-based perspective has a lot of potential to really get at knowledges which are different from those that you are more familiar with. And it's important that we should be trying to do that. And I think that relates a little bit to what Jose was saying as well. So given this, how do we go about doing process and practice studies? So qualitative data is the raw material from my perspective. And what does that mean? That means I call these the big three kinds of qualitative data. So observing, observing interactions, observing conversations, shadowing people, understanding what they're doing. By doing that, we get to observe their behavior, but we may not understand the knowing that is lying behind the behavior. And for that, we may want to engage in interviewing people, understanding how they interpret what they're doing. So that's the second one, the collecting memories and interpretations. And then finally, collecting temporally embedded artifacts. So minutes of meetings, plans, reports, photographs, film, all of these sources are important for doing this kind of research. And so this kind of research is quite demanding and requires people to actually be embedded in the context. And so, but then there are different styles that we can think of doing process and practice research. And I'm just going to list four different kind of foci that you might have for a process of practice study. So one might be you're looking at how a phenomenon evolves over time. And then you need to do a longitudinal case study. So you need to think about looking at, in real time, looking at how phenomena evolve. Then another approach might be a narrative study. So looking at how people experience phenomena. So one possibility would be to look at how managers in an African context represent their tasks through life history interviewing. And so here you're not looking at what is happening in the real world, you're looking at how people understand what they're doing. A third way is looking at how phenomena are constituted through activity that is taking place. So let me think of an example. So an organization is made up of activity. It's not a thing. It's made up of activity. And so one way of looking at a phenomenon from an activity-based perspective is to try and understand what is the activity that keeps the thing going. Any kind of social enterprise, for example, to keep it going, you need to keep doing things every day. What are those things that you need to keep doing in order to sustain things? And then finally, a fourth focus is on intervention, which is understanding how to work to improve practices. And then you would be using different kinds of methods. So I just wanted to draw out the different kinds of ways, different kinds of foci that you might have for a practice and process-based study. And I think we do quite a lot of the first three, probably more of number one and number two, not so much of number three. And number four, we do it, but we don't see much of it in our journals. And that's a shame. I think that there's a lot to be learned from intervention, and we do not see enough of it, notably in the journals that I'm an editor in, and it would be great to see more of that. So I'm just going to give a few examples. I'm conscious of the time, so what time should I, Mira, aim to finish at?
I think we have half hour.
Okay, so I will try and finish in about 10 minutes. Yeah, so we have time for some discussion. Okay, so here's my first example, and I'm going to put Mira and Anka on the spot because they have a really interesting study which has been recently published in Organization Science, which is based on field work in Ghana. And it's really looking at the kinds of knowing that underpin the way in which in the agricultural sector, agricultural specialists interact with farmers in order that their ideas can be made acceptable, and the kinds of rituals that they engage in order to create relations with people in the site and to enable their ideas about more scientific management of agriculture actually to be rendered acceptable and of interest to the community. So congratulations on this study. I don't know if you wanted to add anything at this stage. It's a bit of a surprise, Mira.
Okay.
I didn't tell you I was going to do this.
Yeah, so this is a study that came out of my work in Ghana with the International Food Policy Research Institute, going back to the types of data collection that you mentioned. What we did was shadow agriculture extension agents. And this model shows how relational work based in rituals contributes to transferring knowledge and informational work. So that is what we've been able to find. What it was contributing to the knowledge in the field consisted of pointing out to the relational work, knowledge management, studies of knowledge transfer. Generally in the literature, they were emphasizing the informational work and use of objects such as boundary objects. So that's an example of a contribution that highlights, as Jose was describing, these practices, ritual-based practices, and links to the management literature.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good example. I have a couple of other examples, and the next two examples are really, this one really describes the distinctive kind of practices that you might see in an African context. The next two examples that I'm going to give show you what happens when you get an organization from the north that attempts to intervene in the African context and the kinds of dynamics that play out. And so this is particularly interesting because there you very often see this clash of understandings of different kinds of knowledge bringing to bear. So the first example I'm going to show you is that it's a paper that's published in Academy of Management Journal, and it shows a rather sad story. Okay, it looks as if it's going well, and then it kind of collapses, and it's quite a sad story. The second one is a little bit more uplifting. Okay, so this one is by Klaus Greenwood and Magoo, and it takes place in Tanzania, and it's about, I think it's a Dutch organization that is trying to develop a way to stimulate entrepreneurship in Tanzania by lending money to villages, not to individuals, but to villages in order that they might invest in entrepreneurial activities which would have social impact in their communities. And they developed, it's a longitudinal case study. The third author is a local person who was involved in this effort. And what they found was that it looked as if everything was going very well. And the way they attempted to implement their process or their macro credit work was by engaging local people in promoting the project. So you have this first box here which says concealing foreignness, right? So they made it look as if it was coming from people locally, and they adapted it very carefully to the local environment, which meant that it was really well accepted. And it achieved great results in terms of developing entrepreneurship in the community, and led to various investments by these entrepreneurs in activities like creating schools, community activities. But then there was a slight problem that the understanding of in that environment was that you were there to support the community, and then when the NGO came back and asked to have their money repaid, this didn't fit with the way that exchanges are considered to take place in that environment. And so the local people who had it in the beginning helped to sell the project became persona non grata in the community. And eventually the NGO had to leave because they were not appreciated at all. So this is a kind of sad story. And it's almost as if what it's saying is that the effort to adapt kind of from the beginning hid important differences that needed to have been made transparent from the beginning. And had that occurred, of course, it would have been more difficult to have uptake locally, but at least you would not have had this collapse at the end. The other lesson is that it did some good. It didn't, in the end, persist, but for a while it did some good, and maybe those things should not be under-recognized. So that's a second, which is kind of a sad tale. So this one is, the next one is a very recent paper, and actually I don't think it's even published yet online. I happen to know the author, Anna Kim, and this is a story about the tea industry in Kenya, and the attempt by a global tea company to engage in social responsibility efforts, and including, and they were funded to do this by organizations that were interested in what they call here off-the-shelf practices like fair trade, creating cooperatives, crop diversification. So these kinds of activities. And what we see, and this Anna was an ethnographer and studied this over time. She also looked at narratives. She looked at the narratives coming from the Global Tea Organization and also from the farmers. And so she has collected narratives of their understanding of what was going on. And the story is basically that in order to satisfy the evaluators so that they would get a fair trade certification and could increase their prices, they needed to have stories from the farmers about how wonderful everything was since this program had been put in place. And what you see is they managed to get these stories, but the stories were not telling quite the whole truth. And the whole truth was more that the local people had found ways to do things which had nothing much to do with the program, right? And yes, their lives had improved, but not necessarily because of the program. But they were willing to tell those stories in order to negotiate with the tea company to have other benefits, like, for example, being able to acquire land, being able to have direct relationships with the supplier rather than working through middlemen. And so they found so that this is called a triadic perspective, which sort of shows how every actor, the three corners, the organization, the beneficiaries, and the evaluators, all got something out of this, but it was not the thing that was quite intended. And so that the beneficiaries were able to adjust their practices to improve their lives. The organization, the tea organization, was able to legitimate its corporate social responsibility initiatives. But actually, those two things are a little bit decoupled, creating this kind of negotiation between the three groups. So that's the story I'm summarizing here. I may not have got it 100% correct, but this seems to me to be a more positive story, although it's also got its little kinks, and it shows this difference that we see in perspectives with the global north and the global south, and how that affects the dynamics. It's a different perspective on it. So these two papers also have brought the similar stories underlying them. And these are important things that we need to know more about. My last example is a study which started in South Africa. And this paper is in Strategic Management Journal, and it's about a social enterprise that was able to spread around various places in Africa, including Namibia and Nigeria as well. But the interesting aspect of it is that they were able to spread a kind of a bricolage approach to entrepreneurship. So a bricolage approach to entrepreneurship is, you make do with what you have. Rather than getting major investment from outside investors, you use a local labor that is not trained. In fact, this was an organization involved in helping people afflicted by drug addiction. So they brought former drug addicts into the organization and trained them to help with the programs that they were doing, and basically put together with string and tape the organization. But then what they did in order to diversify geographically was they kind of formalized their little procedures, their bricolage procedures. So they had a book about how you do this when you go into a new setting, and how you could reproduce in a setting where there are no resources, elements that could be spread in other places. So addressing the issue of poverty in a way. And it's an interesting paper because actually Africa is not referred to in the title in any way, shape, or form. And so this paper, in contrast with the other three in a way, is a paper where the context is, of course, it's relevant because this problem occurs in Africa. But I think the message of the authors is, this is something which is universal. You could apply it anywhere. So it's a study in Africa, but it's not necessarily a study. The case is beyond that, lies beyond that. It's not necessarily an African case because it's an African case. It's a case of poverty. It's a case of trying to do things under conditions of poverty. So those are my 4 examples. And this is my last slide, so I hope this is okay. So what can we learn from this? So I think there are kind of 3 ways that from those examples that we can think about how to do this. So the first one is understanding and appreciating the distinctive forms of knowing that underpin organizing practices in an African context. And I think that the first example perhaps reflects that the most. And the second one is understanding how and why processes involving interactions between organizations in the global north and the global south play out as they do. And there are tensions here. And so how they play out, for better, for worse, how can they be made to play out in positive ways that actually deliver the benefits they're supposed to? And then a third one is understanding processes and practices which are kind of generic, but they occur perhaps in an extreme way in an African context, but could be applied anywhere. And the context is perhaps not necessarily what this is about. It is more about the dimensions that underpin it. So poverty in the third case, and poverty exists all over the world. So it's not necessarily about Africa. So there are 3 different ways I think that we can learn. I just wanted to end by, looking at certain tensions that underpin these forms of research. So the first one is, overemphasizing versus downplaying the differences and distinctions of the African context. And I'll just tell a little story here about my student, Kafui Dansu. When she first entered the doctoral program, she was convinced that there was something different about the African context. And she wanted to document that in her research. She had, read about institutional logics in different countries, and there are kinds of typologies of institutional logics, or in her case, it was orders of worth she was interested in. It's a different theoretical framework, but the idea is the same, that there may be different ways of thinking. So there may be a community way, there may be an industrial way, a market way of thinking. And she was looking to see if she could find an African way by reading various texts and so on, and reading management texts in Africa. And what she found was that they didn't really seem, if you dug deeply into it, it was not particularly convincing that there was anything distinctive. There were things that some people raised as being distinctive, like Ubuntu, which we hear a lot about, but maybe that was more the community. It was not necessarily distinctive. And then when she did her empirical work in Senegal,
from the day one,
she began increasingly, sorry.
there's like even the code of conduct.
Okay, can I
Can
continue?
Can everyone on the call please mute? I think you can carry on.
Yeah, okay. So she began to think that, in a way, trying to say that was something different about Africa was problematic. It was problematic, and it was a different form of colonialism. And that when she eventually wrote her thesis, she took really the third perspective, that understanding what was going on in these small nonprofits in Senegal was helpful for understanding what is going on in strategizing in nonprofits anywhere. And it was more useful to think of it this way than to try and say that this is specific to the African context. So I think there's a dilemma there, and there's a tension there that we need to think about. I mean, another thing I think is important is that many of the papers that you saw there, I think that two of them had scholars who are based in an African context on the authorship, and it would be great to see more of that. And we need to publish this stuff more broadly. I gave you some examples, and I think that we need to see more. And hopefully this network will help to generate that. So that's my talk. Open to questions.
Thank you so much. And if you want to, you can stop sharing. We do invite anyone that would like to engage on the conversation. Just raise your hand, add in the chat. We do have some time for questions.
Natasha, you had a question, and then...
Oh, that was just me inviting everybody
Okay.
to feel free to raise a question. I mean, I'll kick it off. And again, somebody new to practice, I have actually done a process study, which landed in your hands and got a really tough review, but a brilliant review. So typically, if we want to do this type of work, when we talk longitudinal, what is a reasonable time frame? I remember in my study, I spent about 4 to 5 months located in the organization, observing things, conversations. So that's quite intensive, but what is the average or a reasonable expectation for longitudinal?
So I would say that it depends what the phenomenon is that you're looking at. It's a function of the phenomenon. So if you're looking at a program, some of these programs where you're trying to implement, corporate social responsibility initiative, what is the length of time that would normally take, and you would know that the outcomes that you were looking for had happened? Now, that would probably be a few years, right? And of course, when you stop the clock, you might see different things. So for example, the first study we looked at, if you'd stopped the clock too soon, you would have said, wow, this is a great success. And then something else happened and it was less of a success. So the choices can make a difference. I mean, the interesting thing with process studies is that time doesn't stop, so you have to cut off at some point and accept that this is what you have up to now, that things will change afterwards in the setting. So it depends on what your focus is on. So in those cases, it's a long program that's being implemented. But let's say you're interested in a small project. Organizations have projects, and 4 months is long enough to project. And you might also have some data collection that is retrospective as well. That's normal that most of the studies that we looked at here have retrospective data, so they don't necessarily stay, the project, the phenomenon maybe several years, but the person was there maybe for a year, and some of this is retrospective. So I think Anna Kim's study, part of it was retrospective, so you don't have to be there all that time. But you can make the length as long as you like. You can study a meeting like this one. How did we interact in this meeting? Then it's not very long. So it's a question of the focus.
Thank you so much. And I think I see we actually have questions. Teho has asked, and I think you referred to it in your PhD students' work, but just asking specifically, using the African context in our study, is it mandatory to publish work that shows what is unique about the context, or studies are acceptable as long as they provide insights to understanding a particular phenomenon?
Yes, so yes, the studies are acceptable as long as they show insights into a particular phenomenon. You might have to justify why you have this context and what difference that might make. For example, the last study we looked at, about the bricolage, it's a situation of poverty, and so it's a case of poverty. It's not a case of Africa. So you have to think, what is this a case of that is not necessarily related to the context? And then that's perfectly fine. And my student, unfortunately, never published anything about her study in Senegal, but she could very well have, and it would have been entirely relevant to strategizing in nonprofits in other contexts as well. Part of her study was about the relationship with funders, international funders. So that part might have been a little bit more related to relations between the global North and the global South because of the pressures for accountability, but all the same, those kinds of relationships of accountability exist also in outside Africa. They exist in all kinds of contexts where funders fund projects, and then you have to write reports to demonstrate that you did what was expected. Yeah. So yes, it is acceptable, but you do need to justify it. I mean, that's it, and explain the boundary conditions that would make that surround it.
I am not noticing any additional questions in the chat.
Katrina would like to ask a question.
Catherine?
Yeah, hi, thanks for the presentation. And actually perhaps continuing the conversation that we were just having and connecting it maybe to Jose, because so Anne is saying one way, like kind of there's a tension between whether seeing it as a case of something broader category or seeing it as something specific to Africa. And Jose, I think in his talk encouraged us to kind of let go of our categories when we go into the African context. So I was just wondering, in terms of doing research, and this is a question to anybody who's doing that, like kind of when you go into and do the research, how are you able to let go of those categories informed by our, I guess, understanding in the broader management literature? Open question to anybody.
And you want to go first?
Well, I mean, it depends what you're looking at. I mean, I think that you know, you're looking at a management team that is making strategy. How, you know, why would it be different? You know, you have to think what is making it different, really, than it would be in any other circumstance. So it's quite easy to sort of let go of the African context in that circumstance. I think many of the studies that look at the relationships, you know, between NGOs and arriving with their programs and the African context are really interesting, but it doesn't have to be Africa. I mean, it's a phenomenon, global North, global South. It's not particularly an African phenomenon, even there, unless there's something distinctively a similar phenomenon might be found in Latin America. It's
Yeah, what I was.
Jose.
Yeah, I spoke too fast eventually. But what I was trying to say, if I got your question correctly, is that often we look at our overarching categories that we then use to apply and so on, the so-called theories, to put it simply, as the perennial element of this, and the practices on the ground as the ephemeral. And I was saying it's precisely the opposite. I think it's precisely the opposite, and links well with the definition that Anne presented of a practice. The practice might seem ephemeral, but it is not, it is perennial. And if you go into contexts in which you have different practices, and those practices being performed differently, with different forms of knowledge informing those practices, the categories that you use might not fit. To give an example from my research in Latin America in this education setting, these schools in the indigenous parts of Ecuador, where I am, they don't start by teaching people how to read and write. They start by teaching them how to read the nature. So the kids are first taught on what is a stone, what is this animal, what do these animals do, how do they relate to the broader religion. Only later, when they are 10 or 11, they start reading and writing. But they already read the nature before reading that. So this is what I meant.
Yeah, and so I agree with that. And I think, you know, that's the whole idea of the practice perspective, that what you do is based on tacit knowing that you have learned throughout your lifetime, and that can change what you do. And I think that that's very important. And you know, the two studies that we showed, the two middle studies, that's clearly what's going on. You know, that there is a complete mismatch between the local knowledge and way of being around farming than the kind of formal frameworks that are being imposed, and that mismatch creates the processes that you're seeing. But that's a kind of general statement. That's a general statement, and I think that you would see that playing out in different ways. And what we saw there was two different, interesting, different ways that that confrontation played out. In one case, rather catastrophically. In the other case, sort of with a kind of a accommodation that seemed to satisfy everybody. So I think that, you know, that is general, but the specific knowledge that made that difference is not.
If I may, Anne, there was something that you said that got my, and that, well, two things, that paper about the payments and non-payments, and the fact that your PhD student invested lots of time in understanding the context, which made me think, because going back to the categories, for instance, in Latin America, you have several indigenous languages for which there is no word for exchange, economic exchange. That's why I said we have taken care of all this in classic sociology, lots of work on the notion of gifts, just as a starter, but we forgot all that. And so I think when we go into this context, I myself invest a lot in reading, including literature, because otherwise you can end up in that mistake, or accelerate that thing through co-authorship, obviously. Otherwise, that non-payment that Anne Langley mentioned would be totally misunderstood and incorrectly.
Well, yes, so it was completely misunderstood, but because of the kind of knowing that was present in that environment. So yes, I agree that you do need to understand the context, but it's possible there are some things that are not as different as we would like to claim that they are. You know.
Yeah, for sure.
And claiming difference can be insulting in some cases. You have to think about it. It's like, you know, the differences is, if I want to make an analogy, you know, the difference between women and men, you know, and how they behave, being told, for a woman to be told, oh, you're nurturing, and so it can be insulting.
April would like to add?
Can I pick up on that point, Anne? Thank you for that. That was an interesting presentation. We have a study on doctors in Kenya, which I know you're aware about, of novice physicians.
Yes.
And it's about the values violations that you sometimes experience as novice professionals when you go out into public hospitals and you see things that occur because there aren't enough resources in a lot of these settings. And as a result of that, things that you're expecting and aspiring to accomplish in terms of acting in the best interest of the patient are really difficult. Now, that's not unique to Kenya. To suggest that it is own, you know, that is an African phenomenon or a Kenyan phenomenon is completely false. That happens in emergency departments, in hospitals around the world. It happens in public schools, in underfunded areas. It happens everywhere. It's just that our case allows us to see something because, you know, perhaps there are more instances of this, or it was just more observable there. And I'm kind of with you on this point, and so are the other authors on the team who are, that it's kind of offensive to suggest that this is just an African problem, that novice professionals in any of these kind of human services professions are going to go out to work and see these, you know, constant values violations because the system is broken in Kenya. When the system is broken in all of the public hospital, public education, you know, social work systems, public law around the world. So, yeah, the only problem we have is one reviewer is suggesting it's an African problem and we should have framed it around Africa up front. So I might follow up with you later on that one. But, yeah, that's
no, it is difficult.
It's offensive.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a tension. I think on the one hand, yes, and on the other hand, no. You know, it's sort of what do you do? And it depends on the study and what you're trying to get at. But yeah. And I think having someone from the region involved in the research is very important for those reasons.
Yeah.
Because of the sensitivity that person might be able to bring on both sides of that issue.
Yeah, and for them, because it's quite important not to
Yes.
present as if this is something that is unique to that.
And that was the feeling of my student. She felt, oh, this is kind of I'm being reduced by this notion that Africa is different, not raised up by it.
Do we have any more comments from the audience, from the people who are on the call?
Thank you, Mira. There's no additional questions in the chat, and we don't have a hand. And just to be mindful on our time, we have about 10 more minutes left. I think this was a very engaging conversation, and basically just emphasize why we need this network and have to continue collaborating on these elements. From my side, definitely, and you are not a guest, you're actually integral part in the team unofficially. But thank you so much for your time today and sharing these insights. It was very interesting and engaging. There was a question in the chat about, are we going to share the slides? So we will definitely do the introductions and everything and add it to the website as well. And I think I saw a nod from Anne as well. Happy to share the papers.
So obviously, some of the authors of the papers that I mentioned might be people to invite, to talk, give you much more depth in some of the studies. I know that Anna Kim has done several studies in Kenya. Yeah,
definitely. Thank you so much. So we have one more comment or somebody to hear from, and he's just joined us. So to close our conversation, on our side, definitely doesn't need a big introduction. As I was driving in this morning, I heard him on the news, and then he was teaching on the electives, and now he's in Oudtshoorn, preparing for a session tomorrow. So Prof. Andre Roux, very welcome, and thank you so much for making the effort to join us. Prof. Roux is a professor in economics at the Stellenbosch Business School. He's head of teaching and learning, and he's also a professor in future studies on our master's program. So to close our session, he will share a few insights on behalf of the business school. Thanks, Andre. Can I?
Thank you, Natasha. Would you? All right, so I can share. Apologies for being late. I've been on the road for 6 hours, reaching this destination, just made it in time. I wasn't even sure about the plausibility of having internet, but fortunately they do seem to have it. I'll be very quick and very brief. I'll kick off by, first of all, not even trying to show a slide. Let's forget about that. I'll kick off by saying that at Stellenbosch University Business School, we are extremely excited and happy and proud to be part of this collaborative. And there are various reasons for that. One is an obvious one, the relevance of the initiative, the quality of the partners involved, but also because it fits in so neatly with the way we have been evolving our product offerings, our program offerings over the last number of years. I came at the back end of a fairly long discourse by the sounds of things about, is Africa unique or not? I've got some thoughts about that, but certainly there can be no doubt that as much as global forces are relevant to Africa, we all share that, we all have that in common. At the same time, there are some issues which are perhaps even more profoundly important for Africa. So quite some time ago, we abandoned the old adage that the business of business is business. And we now say the business of business is no longer just all about business. So unlike in the old days when the MBA was very kind of profit-orientated, how to make money, how to get bigger and bigger, etc., we have not abandoned the MBA, but we actually have 13 different programs covering a wide variety of specialities. So we have a set of programs in development finance. And you would appreciate in Africa, that is crucial. One of the most biggest imperatives for Africa's development is gaining access to, but also using finance in a sensible fashion. So we have a postgraduate diploma and a master's in development finance. I introduced about 25 years ago 2 programs in future studies, not all that well known, not highly unusual, but not all that well known. And in fact, future studies at this business school is celebrating this year its 50th birthday. We've been around for a long time. And again, future studies is universal, but part of the objective of our programs is to enable participants, strategic managers, strategists, policymakers to look at issues, understand issues from a global perspective, but also from an African and national perspective, and create things like scenarios and the like. Then we have Natasha's program in leadership, obviously, and the business school has built up, I think, a very proud reputation of its emphasis on leadership and responsible leadership and stewardship and the like. We have a very important program, especially for Africa. I'm going to use these words, diploma, postgraduate diploma in project management. Very often we find in Africa that we have good ideas, good plans, even money available, but not always the ability, the wherewithal to make these plans happen. So project management is crucial and a very popular offering, by the way. We have programs, postgraduate programs in coaching, and we have programs in financial planning. But what I'm really trying to say here is it's way more than simply running a business. We believe that businesses operate within a much wider context. Sustainability has become a big thing, and rightly so, at our university, at our business school and university. Leadership is a big thing. Visions of the future become a big thing. And hence, as I say, there's a pretty wide variety of programs, which implies, of course, that at the business school, we have a wide variety of competencies amongst our faculty, core faculty, and part-time faculty, covering all these disciplines plus many more. Psychology, including dealing with stress in the workplace, including an expert, in fact, a world-renowned expert in ADHD, as a measure of future studies, statistics. It really is a wide variety. And we can say, I think proudly, that the stuff we do is not only multidisciplinary, it's also transdisciplinary. That we are joining forces to try to create brand new knowledge. Then I thought I will try to show you just one slide, which I think might be of particular relevance. There are many others I could show you, but I've only got a couple of minutes left. Of particular relevance to part of the conversation a few minutes ago, but also, I think, something that we often use, or we start to use more and more in future studies. It's a model developed, in fact, by a world-renowned futurist, Suahil Inayatullah. It's called causal layered analysis. And he typically uses the iceberg as a sort of a metaphor for this, where we look at problems and issues at 4 different levels of analysis. And this enables us to get to grips with how different kinds of people, different stakeholders, different vested interests perceive an issue. So the tip of the iceberg at the top is the problem, as it were, the litany, as we call it, the official public description of an issue. And that's an ongoing, continuous kind of situation. But then just below that, we have the layer called causes. This stretches over years. Here we're looking for explanations for that litany, using whatever tools necessary, systems analysis, interconnections, you name it. Then a layer below that, we try to understand this issue by describing a worldview. Here we have things such as culture and values and language. And then at the very bottom of the iceberg, those ancient bedrock stories, the metaphors and the myths that society used to describe that particular issue. It's a useful model in its own right, but becoming also more and more useful in really understanding human behavior and really trying to bring about what we call affective, not effective, but affective future thinking. Being aware of a future's consciousness, being aware that in any group of people, there are different shadows, different emotions, different ways of thinking, different ways of thinking about the future, the elephants in the room, different cognitive methodologies, different interpretation of values and ethics. And this kind of model, when done correctly, is extremely valuable in trying to gain a narrative, as it were, of how different members of society think about things. So to give you, and there's so many examples I could show you, at the moment, well, there we are, suddenly it's working again. So using an example presented by Emerita himself, the litany is water shortages are likely. We often see this in, let's say, the media. That's a litany. The system would be then to try to dig a bit deeper. So typically we might see people saying, if only government would manage water better, there would be no shortages. So the reason presented here for water shortages is poor management. Then digging a bit deeper, the worldview. We need a left green water system, not a market system. And then the myth and the metaphor. What story do you believe about the nature of existence? Some higher body gave earth to man to do with as he wishes. So it takes a bit of getting used to, but I can really see this being a very useful tool to employ and a lot of the stuff we want to look at. If I may end off, perhaps controversially, given the nature of the discourse a bit earlier, you know, the whole story about is there an African view, an African way of thinking, an African management theory? Is there an African way of thinking about the future? My view would be there's an additional layer, an obvious one really. And that is, first of all, no, there is not an African view, because what is Africa? Africa's 54 countries. So I think, and you mentioned, I came to the back end, something about Senegal. Well, that's not Africa. Obviously, Senegal is in Africa, but it might be totally different in other countries. You know, we think about 54 countries, different geographies, different histories, different legacies, different policies, you name it, lots of differences. So one could almost argue there are 54 different Africas. And even that's not granular enough, because within any country, you will find obviously a rural population, but increasingly an urban population, an urban emerging young population, and their values and ways of thinking might be totally different to that of slightly older people living elsewhere. So I don't think we need to be bashful or reluctant to recognize context. You know, if I were to ask you, some of you, is there a European way of dealing with management? The answer might be no, I don't know, but it could be different countries, even within Europe, deal with these things differently. So I think if the context calls for it, and we mustn't force the issue, but where relevant, I do think that actually understanding that context is important. There's so many examples one could think about. 20 years ago, only half of Africa's population, adult population, had ever used a telephone, had ever seen a telephone. Talking about a good old-fashioned landline. The word poverty was mentioned. I'm pretty sure that the way poverty is, let's say, defined in the USA is not the same as the way it's defined in rural Zimbabwe. So I think there are differences that do play a role. But we can take this conversation, obviously, at another level. I don't think we want to pursue this now.
I'm not saying a word.
You have exceeded my 10 minutes. See my
That's
10 minutes, and I think I've
existing
exceeded my. I've
uniqueness,
exceeded.
maybe.
Sorry?
I'm not saying there are no differences.
No, I know. No, I'm just saying there's actually an added layer of complexity, and that
Absolutely.
is about rural versus urban.
Absolutely.
And
And every organization is different. Every little community is different.
No,
in that
exactly.
sense.
Exactly. So I would be reluctant to talk about an African model, because that would imply Africa as one homogeneous blob, and it isn't. As we all know, I'm stating the obvious, but perhaps one would need to provide the context of the country or countries involved within Africa. Natasha, I think I've exceeded my 10 minutes, and I think my bandwidth in this guest house is starting to play games with me.
Thank you so much,
So from
Andre.
my side, thank you so much, everybody. And
for
let's
joining us.
wish all of ourselves luck with the endeavor that lies ahead.